The morning mist clung to the surface of the great lake like a silken shroud, obscuring the horizon where the water met the sky. Standing at the prow of a weathered wooden vessel, Jayavarman II watched the familiar silhouette of the Cambodian coastline emerge through the haze. He had spent years in the distant courts of Java, a noble hostage in a land of volcanic peaks and intricate shadow plays. Now, the scent of the Mekong, a heady mixture of damp earth, decaying lilies, and ancient stone, filled his lungs, grounding him in a reality he had almost forgotten. The land he returned to was a fractured mosaic of rivalries, where the shadows of the past loomed larger than the promises of the future. The once great power of Chenla had splintered into 1,000 jagged pieces, with local lords vying for dominance over rice paddies and river trade. To the casual observer, it was a region of perpetual strife, but to Jayavarman it was a canvas awaiting a master's brush. He adjusted the silk wrap at his waist, his fingers brushing the hilt of a ceremonial blade. His eyes, sharp and steady, surveyed the emerald canopy of the jungle that guarded the secrets of his ancestors. "The spirits of the land are restless, my lord," a voice murmured behind him. It was Sivakaivalya, a priest whose wisdom was as deep as the temple wells. "They have felt the shift in the wind since your departure from the Sailendra court." Jayavarman did not turn. "The winds do not just shift, priest. They are commanded. For too long our people have bowed to masters across the sea, or knelt before petty kings who cannot see beyond their own village walls. I did not return to be another name in a long list of failures." The boat glided into a narrow tributary, the oarsman's rhythmic splashing the only sound in the humid air. Along the banks, villagers paused their work to stare at the stranger with the regal bearing. They saw a man whose presence seemed to command the very air around him. Jayavarman felt the weight of their gaze, the desperate hope of a people tired of war. In his mind, he saw the peaks of Mahendraparvata, the sacred mountain where the gods were said to dwell. He knew that to unite this land, he needed more than iron and fire. He needed a spiritual mandate that would transcend the bloodlines of old. He sought to create something permanent, an empire that would mirror the celestial order of the heavens themselves. "We proceed to the heart of the interior," Jayavarman commanded, his voice echoing with a new-found authority. "Gather the loyalists. Tell the local chieftains that the son of the mountains has returned, not as a vassal, but as a sovereign. We shall no longer pay tribute to those who live across the churning tides." As the sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the fog, the landscape revealed its rugged beauty. The ruins of old brick towers stood like sentinels among the trees, reminders of a glory that had faded but not vanished. Jayavarman stepped off the boat and onto the mud-slicked bank. The earth was warm beneath his feet, pulsating with a hidden energy. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the pulse of the soil, the heartbeat of a nation waiting to be born. This was the beginning of a long march toward a crown of gold and a legacy of stone. The journey toward the summit had begun, and with it, the dawn of a new era.
The dawn of a new era broke over the humid horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the Mekong's restless waters. Jayavarman opened his eyes, the warmth of the soil still anchoring him to this sacred geography. Behind him, a small group of loyal retainers disembarked, their movements silent and disciplined. They were men who had followed him from the courts of Java, bound by an oath that transcended the salt spray of the sea. Among them was Sivakaivalya, a priest whose wisdom was as deep as the roots of the banyan trees that strangled the stone temples of the old gods. The shadows of the past were long, but the light of the future was stronger. "My lord," Sivakaivalya whispered, stepping beside him, "the air here is heavy with the scent of old ghosts. The lords of this land are divided, their spirits broken by years of servitude to the southern islands. They will not welcome a new master easily." Jayavarman turned, his gaze sharpening. I do not come to be another master, old friend. I come to be the soul of this land. A king is nothing if he is merely a collector of taxes. He must be the bridge between the heavens and the earth." He looked toward the dense canopy where the shrieks of macaques echoed like mocking laughter. To the north lay the heart of the fractured kingdoms, a mosaic of petty rivalries and fading grandeur. For centuries, the people had been scattered like rice husks in the wind, vulnerable to the whims of the Shailandra kings. They began their march inland, moving through the tangled undergrowth where the heat became a physical weight. Every step was a reclamation. Jayavarman noticed the scars on the landscape, burned outposts and neglected shrines where the moss had swallowed the faces of the Devatas. In a small clearing, they encountered a village of thatched huts perched on stilts. The inhabitants emerged cautiously, their ribs visible beneath sun-darkened skin, eyes wide with a mixture of terror and curiosity. They saw not just a man, but a figure of striking presence, dressed in silks that had survived the voyage, yet marked by the dust of the road. A village elder, his back curved like a bow, stepped forward and knelt in the mud. He did not ask for gold or food, he asked for peace. Jayavarman reached down, his fingers brushing the man's calloused hand. It was a gesture of humility that stunned the onlookers. "The days of bowing to distant horizons are over," Jayavarman announced, his voice carrying the resonance of a temple bell. "We shall build a mountain that does not crumble, and a house that no tide can wash away." The seeds of rebellion were sown in that mud-slicked clearing. Jayavarman knew that to unite the Khmer, he needed more than an army. He needed a symbol. He needed a place where the gods could reside among men. Moving toward the heights of Mahendraparvata, the prince began to map out a kingdom in his mind. It would be a realm defined by stone and water, a testament to the eternal. The march was no longer just a physical journey, it was the slow awakening of a sleeping giant. The jungle seemed to part, recognizing its master. The first fires of a sovereign flame were flickering to life, and the smoke would soon be seen from the farthest reaches of the Great Lake.
The smoke drifted across the horizon, visible from the farthest reaches of the Great Lake, signaling to the scattered chieftains that the era of fragmented rule was nearing its end. Jayavarman II pressed upward, his boots treading upon the sacred soil of Mahendraparvata, the mountain of great Indra. Each step was a defiance of the Javanese lords who had once held his people in a suffocating grip. He was no longer a prince in exile or a mere vassal. He was the vessel of a nation's rebirth. Beside him walked Sivakaivalya, a priest whose eyes held the depth of ancient scriptures. They spoke little, for the mountain itself seemed to speak for them, the rustle of the leaves sounding like the whispers of ancestors. "Here," Jayavarman said, pausing at a plateau where the earth met the sky. "Here, where the water flows from the heavens to feed the plains, we shall build the heart of the world." He looked out over the sprawling green carpet of the Tonle-Sap Basin, seeing not just forest, but cities of stone yet to be born. The prince knew that to unify the warring factions of Chenla, he needed more than just a sharp blade. He needed a legend. He commanded his craftsmen to begin carving the sacred symbols into the living rock, turning the mountain into a sanctuary. The local lords, hearing of his ascent, began to gather at the base of the peaks. Some came with tribute, their eyes wide with awe at the prince's commanding presence. Others came with hidden daggers, skeptical of this man who claimed to be more than a king. One such lord, a chieftain from the eastern marshes named Phra, challenged Jayavarman's right to command. "The islands of the south still demand our gold," Phra argued, his hand resting on the hilt of his bronze sword. "What makes you think a mountain can shield us from their ships?" Jayavarman did not reach for his weapon. Instead, he walked toward the chieftain until their chests nearly touched. "I do not seek to hide behind a mountain," the prince replied, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. "I seek to become the mountain. When the ritual is complete, the gods will not look down upon us, they will live among us. The gold you send to foreign shores will stay here, to build temples that will stand when the sea has swallowed the islands." The conviction in his voice silenced the doubters.
Over the following weeks, the summit became a hive of activity. Stone was hauled, water was diverted into sacred channels, and the air was thick with sandalwood and incense. Jayavarman spent his nights in meditation, purging the remnants of his Javanese upbringing to make room for the soul of his people. He was preparing for the Devaraja cult, the rite that would declare him a god king, a ruler whose authority was not granted by men, but by the divine order of the universe. The mountain was no longer just a landmark, it was becoming a throne. As the moon waxed full over the peaks, the prince looked at his hands, calloused from labor and stained with the red earth of his home. He felt the weight of the future pressing upon his shoulders. The giant was awake now, and its first breath was a roar that echoed across the plains, announcing to the world that the Khmer were no longer a people of many masters, but a people of one destiny. The gods were watching, and the ritual was ready.
The gods were watching, and as the ritual began, the first light of dawn pierced the shroud of mist, and Jayavarman ascended the stone tiers of the makeshift pyramid. Beside him walked the Brahmin Hiranyadama, a man whose eyes held the wisdom of ancient scriptures and the fire of a new era. The mountain air was thin and cold, biting at the prince's skin, but he did not flinch. Around them, the high priests chanted in a tongue that seemed to vibrate within the very bedrock of the mountain. This was not merely a ceremony of state, it was a cosmic alignment. The smoke from the sacred fire spiraled upward, a silver thread connecting the terrestrial realm to the celestial abode of Shiva. Jayavarman knelt before the golden linga, the symbol of divine creative power. As Hiranyadama began the incantations of the Devaraja cult, a profound silence fell over the assembled warriors and chiefs. They had come from the flooded plains of the south and the dense jungles of the north, skeptical men bound together only by the prince's iron will. Now they watched as their leader prepared to shed his mortality. The Brahmin raised a vessel of consecrated water, its surface shimmering like liquid starlight. He poured it over the linga, and the runoff bathed Jayavarman's hands, washing away the red earth and the stains of labor he had contemplated only moments before. From this breath forward, Hiranyadama's voice boomed, echoing off the sandstone cliffs. You are no longer a servant of the southern isles. You are the Chakravartin, the universal monarch. Your kingdom is the earth, and your soul is the sky. A surge of power, primal and overwhelming, coursed through Jayavarman. He felt the fractured lands of Chenla, long divided by petty feuds and foreign meddling, knitting together in his mind. He saw the great lake, the Tonle Sap, as the heart of a body that he would now animate. The Javanese shadow that had loomed over his youth evaporated in the heat of the sacred flame. He stood up, turning to face the horizon. Below him, the vast expanse of Cambodia stretched out, a green ocean waiting for a tide to guide it. The weight of the future was no longer a burden, but a source of strength. The chiefs felt the shift. It was a physical pressure, a change in the wind. One by one they dropped to their knees, their swords clattering against the stone. This was the birth of an empire, forged not just by steel, but by a divine mandate that none could challenge. Jayavarman raised his arms, and the sun broke fully over the horizon, bathing the mountain in gold. He was no longer just a man named Jayavarman, he was the living link between the people and the gods. The name of the ritual, the Devaraja, was whispered among the ranks until it became a rhythmic pulse. The era of tribute is over, the new king declared, his voice carrying with a strength that silenced morning birds. We shall build a city that reflects the heavens, and we shall write a history that the stars themselves will envy. No longer shall our sons bow to foreign shores. The ritual had transformed the mountain into a center of the universe. As the priests continued their prayers, the king looked towards the distant plains. There was much to be done, irrigation to be mastered, stones to be carved, and enemies to be unified. For this moment, under the watchful eyes of ancestors, the Khmer were one. The foundation was laid. The foundation was laid, but a foundation was merely stone and spirit until it was tested by the weight of a living civilization. Jayavarman II descended the slopes of Mahendraparvata not as a mere chieftain, but as a Chakravartin whose shadow now stretched across the Tonle Sap. The spiritual fire of the mountain still burned in his heart, yet his eyes were fixed on the mud and silt of the lowlands. To rule the heavens, one first had to master the waters of the earth. He called his surveyors to the plateau's edge, pointing toward the sprawling plains of Halalia. The rains are a blessing from Indra, he declared, his voice carrying the authority of the divine ritual, but a blessing wasted if it flows unheeded into the sea. We shall build great reservoirs to hold the sky's tears and feed the soil when the sun turns cruel. Jayavarman knew that unity required more than a shared god, it required shared survival. He spent months traveling between scattered settlements, acting as a bridge between the fractured old ways and the new dawn of the Khmer. He didn't just command, he listened to the elders who understood the rhythm of the Mekong. Together, they mapped out the first barais, basins that would serve as the lifeblood of the empire. Thousands flocked to his banner because he offered a vision where hunger was a memory. As the first embankments rose, so did the people's pride. They were no longer disparate tribes fighting over narrow strips of land. They were the architects of a destiny. In the heart of the plains, the city of Halalia began to take shape. It was to be a mirror of celestial order, a place where the king's palace stood as the earthly anchor for the cosmic mountain. Jayavarman walked among the labourers, his robes stained with the red dust of the earth. He watched as the first sandstone blocks were quarried and hauled by herds of elephants. Wood was replaced by stone, for the king intended his legacy to outlast the fragility of the flesh. "We do not build for our own lifetimes," he told his son, who followed him through the rising scaffolding. "We build so that the future will know that here, at the centre of the world, a people once decided to become eternal." Yet the path was not without thorns. To the east and west, remnants of the old nobility watched with wary, envious eyes. They remembered the Java raids and the chaos of the divided kingdoms, fearing the weight of a single crown. Jayavarman met their skepticism with a mixture of iron and silk. To those who pledged loyalty, he offered positions of honor in his court. To those who resisted, he showed the devastating precision of his spearmen and the indomitable will of a man who believed he was ordained by the gods. He wove a tapestry of alliances, knotting the threads of power until the region felt the pull of his center. By the end of the harvest season, the landscape had been changed. The glint of water in the new reservoirs reflected the setting sun, a testament to the king's ambition. As Jayavarman stood upon the terrace of his palace, he looked out at the lights of 1,000 fires dotting the plain. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of hammers. The spiritual union of the mountain had become a physical reality. His people were fed, his borders were tightening, and the roar of the Khmer lion was beginning to echo across the borders of the known world. The age of wandering was over. The era of the empire had begun.
The age of wandering was over. The era of the empire had begun. Standing amidst the cooling night air of Mahendraparvata, Jayavarman knew that his proclamation of independence from Java was merely the first strike of the chisel against the mountain of history. The spiritual fire he had ignited atop the holy summit now needed to be channeled into the veins of the earth itself. He turned away from the terrace, his shadow long and imposing against the sandstone walls of his inner sanctum, where his most trusted advisers and high priests awaited his command. "A king is nothing without a kingdom that breathes and prospers," Jayavarman spoke, his voice low but carrying the weight of his newly minted divine authority. "The gods have granted us the mountain, but the people require the plains. We must bind the waters to our will, just as we have bound the spirits of the ancestors to our cause." The chief Brahmin, Hiranyadharma, bowed deeply in the shadows, the sacred threads across his chest shimmering like silver in the torchlight. "The Devaraja ritual has forged the link, my lord. The people no longer see a mere man, they see the shadow of Shiva upon the earth. But the lords of the southern wetlands still whisper of the old ways. They remember the tribute sent to the maritime kings of the south, and their hearts are still divided between fear and hope."
Jayavarman walked to a large table where a map, etched onto dried animal hide, lay unfurled. His finger traced the silver veins of the mighty Mekong and the vast pulsating heart of the Tonle Sap Lake. To rule this land, he realized, he could not simply remain perched upon a sacred peak like a distant bird of prey. He had to descend. He had to build a system where the monsoon rains were not a curse of flooding, but a managed blessing of abundance. "We shall establish the barais," Jayavarman declared, gesturing with a steady hand to the deep depressions in the lush terrain near the lake. "Every drop of water that falls from the heavens must be captured and guarded. When the rice fields are gold 3 times a year, the whispers of the southern lords will turn into songs of praise. No man rebels against the hand that feeds him." He spent the following weeks riding through the nascent settlements. He watched as thousands of laborers, moved by a mixture of religious fervor and the promise of stability, began to excavate the massive basins that would become the lifeblood of the land. The clinking of iron against stone was the heartbeat of the rising state. He reorganized the administrative districts, appointing loyal followers as governors who answered directly to the central palace. This was the birth of the Khmer bureaucracy, a complex web of tax collectors, engineers, and soldiers, all woven into a single tapestry of loyalty. However, as the sun set over the expanding horizon of his ambitions, a shadow lingered on the edge of his vision. To the east and west, the neighboring kingdoms watched the smoke of his kilns with growing apprehension. Jayavarman knew that true peace was a fragile sheet of glass. It required a sturdy wall of iron to protect its delicate surface. He summoned his generals, his eyes reflecting the flickering orange glow of the hearth. The empire was no longer a dream. It was a living, hungry entity that required protection and expansion. He knew that while the gods dwelt in the heights, the empire would thrive on the waters below. The mountain had been his cradle, but the Great Lake would be his throne.
The mountain had been his cradle, but the Great Lake would be his throne. As the sun crested the serrated peaks of Mahendraparvata, Jayavarman II led a sprawling procession down the winding sandstone paths toward the horizon. Behind him lay the sanctity of the high plateau. Before him stretched the shimmering emerald vastness of the Tonle Sap. The descent was not merely a physical journey, but a strategic pivot that would define the centuries to come. His generals, hardened by years of mountain skirmishes, looked upon the sprawling plains with a mixture of awe and trepidation. The land here was soft, prone to the whims of the seasonal monsoons, yet it pulsed with a life force that the dry heights could never provide. "The gods demand temples of stone," Jayavarman remarked to his chief architect, Indravarma, whose hands were permanently stained with the gray dust of the quarries. "But the people demand rice and a way to reach the world beyond our borders. We shall build a city where the water meets the rich earth, a place where the pulse of the river serves the will of the king of the mountain." They reached the northern shores of the Great Lake by the time the moon had begun its silver ascent. The site he chose was Hariharalaya, a name that invoked the unity of Shiva and Vishnu, a balance of destruction and preservation. It was a region of fertile silt and dense tangled jungle, where the Mekong's reverse flow annually transformed the landscape into a sprawling inland sea. Jayavarman stood at the edge of the marshes, his leather boots sinking into the rich, dark loam. This was the foundation of his power. Unlike the isolated peaks, the lake was a hub of commerce and communication, a watery highway that connected his once dispirited territories into a single cohesive heart. However, the transition was not without its challenges. Local chieftains, who had long ruled these floodplains as independent lords, viewed the arrival of the Deva Raja with deep-seated skepticism. They were men of the water, accustomed to the seasonal rhythms of the lake, and they did not easily bow to a king who claimed his mandate from a distant, misty peak. Jayavarman knew that words alone would not suffice to win their loyalty. He ordered his engineers to begin the immediate construction of a massive baray, a reservoir that would tame the erratic waters. It was a demonstration of divine engineering, a sign that the king of the mountain could command the very elements that governed their daily lives. As the first heavy wooden piles were driven into the thick mud to support his royal residence,
Jayavarman felt the shift in his own spirit. The mountain had offered him protection and the title of a god-king, but the lake offered him the means to feed a growing empire. He watched the fishermen casting their nets into the orange-tinted waters of the sunset, their rhythmic movements echoing the shapes of the ancient spirits that guarded the deep. The empire was expanding, breathing, and drinking from the soul of the land. The iron wall he had promised his generals was finally taking shape, not just in blades of bronze and steel, but in the massive dikes and levees that would harness the lifeblood of the Khmer people. The dream of Mahendraparvata was solidifying into the reality of a sovereign kingdom that would never know thirst, forever rooted in the fertile silt of the Great Lake.
Rooted in the fertile silt of the Great Lake, Jayavarman II stood atop the rising embankment of the new reservoir, his eyes tracing the silver veins of water diverted from the mountain streams. The fertility of the silt promised a future where his subjects would flourish, yet the king knew that water and stone were only the body of his kingdom. It needed a soul, a divine anchor to bind the scattered tribes and the defiant lords into a single, unbreakable entity. The shadows of the Java lords still lingered in the whispers of the old guard, a ghost of vassalage that he was determined to exorcise forever. He felt the breath of the ancestors in the rising heat of the day. He summoned the high priests, led by the learned sage Hiranyadharma, to the highest peak of the sacred mountain. The air at Mahendraparvata was thin and crisp, carrying the scent of crushed jasmine and damp earth. "The dikes are built, and the fields are fed," Jayavarman declared, his voice cutting through the humid morning mist. "But a king who rules only by the sword and the plough is merely a man. I must become more. This land must belong to no one but its own gods, and I shall be their conduit." Hiranyadharma nodded, his eyes reflecting the deep wisdom of the sacred scripts. He spoke of the Deva Raja, the God King. By this ceremony, Jayavarman would be transformed, his essence merged with the divine power of the Great Lord, making him a sovereign of the universe, a Chakravartin, beholden to no earthly lord in Java or beyond. It was the final step in his ascension, a spiritual barrier to match the physical ones he had built. The priest explained that the ritual would draw down the heavens, pinning the sky to the Khmer earth. For weeks, preparations consumed the plateau. Stonemasons carved intricate pedestals, while architects laid the foundations for a temple mountain, mirroring the celestial Meru. Jayavarman watched as heavy blocks of sandstone were hauled up the slopes, the rhythmic chanting of the workers harmonizing with the pulse of the jungle. He saw not just workers, but a nation being forged in the heat of shared purpose and divine labor. Every stone laid was a rejection of foreign dominance, a monument to the autonomy of the Khmer spirit. As the auspicious night approached, the king fasted, purifying his spirit in the mountain falls. He looked over the sprawling landscape, seeing the distant smoke from kitchen fires and the glint of spears at the frontier outposts. His people were ready. They no longer looked towards the sea with fear, they looked towards the mountain with hope for a golden age. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, the very leaves seeming to hold their breath as the celestial alignment drew near, the stars pulsing in time with his own heartbeat. On the eve of the consecration, Hiranyadharma approached the king near the newly erected linga. "Once the fire is lit and the mantras are spoken," the priest warned, "there is no returning to the life of a mortal chieftain. You will be the axis upon which this world turns." Jayavarman placed his hand on the cool stone, his resolve hardening like the mountain itself. He was no longer just a warrior. He was the architect of a destiny that would echo through the centuries, ready to lead them. The fire was prepared, and the silence of the night was absolute. The fire was prepared, and the silence of the night was absolute. High atop the mist-shrouded peaks of Mahendraparvata, the Brahmin priest Dharma stepped forward. He held a bronze vessel containing sacred oils, his eyes reflecting the flickering orange glow of the pyre. As the first drop touched the wood, a spark leapt toward the stars, and the silence was shattered by the rhythmic drone of ancient Sanskrit verses. Jayavarman stood motionless, his silhouette etched against the jagged skyline. The smoke rose in a spiraling pillar, seeking the heavens, carrying with it the aspirations of a people who had long known only division and vassalage. The heat of the flames began to radiate outward, warming the cold stone of the linga. Jayavarman felt a strange vibration beneath his palms, as if the very mountain were responding to the incantations. This was the moment of transformation. The priest raised his voice, calling upon the gods to descend into the stone, to tether the divine essence to the earthly realm through the body of the king. Jayavarman felt the weight of his mortality slipping away, replaced by a heavy, golden responsibility. He was no longer merely a man of flesh and blood. He was becoming the Deva Raja, the god-king whose authority was sanctioned by the cosmos. In the dancing shadows, the faces of his loyal commanders were visible, warriors who had bled beside him from the delta to the highlands. They watched with bated breath, realizing that this ceremony was the birth of more than just a title. It was the birth of an empire. The fragmented chiefdoms of Chenla were being forged into a single, unbreakable sword. Jayavarman looked into the heart of the fire and saw the future he had dreamed of in his years of exile. He saw great stone temples rising from the jungle, vast reservoirs reflecting the monsoon clouds, and a city that would become the wonder of the world. "I renounce the yoke of the Javanese," Jayavarman proclaimed, his voice cutting through the roar of the flames. "I renounce the tributes paid in blood and silver to foreign shores. From this day forward, the Khmer people shall bow to no one but the divine order." The priest poured the final libation, and a brilliant white light seemed to flare within the heart of the pyre. The transition was complete. The spiritual umbilical cord that tied their lands to overseas powers was severed. Jayavarman was now the Chakravartin, the universal monarch whose wheel of power would turn across the horizon. As the rituals reached their zenith, the heavy darkness of the night began to bleed into the pale greys of pre-dawn. The air on the mountain grew crisp and charged with an electric energy. Jayavarman turned away from the sacred fire to face the east, where the first sliver of the sun was beginning to crown the distant horizon. The light spilled over the lush canopy of the valley below, illuminating the vast territory that was now his to protect and expand. He looked at his hands, finding them steady. The burden of godhood was immense, yet he felt strangely light. He walked to the edge of the plateau, looking down at the awakening world. The age of the warriors had evolved into the era of the kings. Tomorrow the construction would begin. Today, the empire breathed its first breath.
The empire breathed its first breath, and as the golden light of the sun climbed higher, Jayavarman II turned away from the precipice. His shadow stretched long across the stone floor of the newly consecrated temple, reaching towards the generals and priests who waited in hushed reverence. They saw not just a man who had conquered the Mekong's fractured lands, but a Chakravartin, a universal ruler whose destiny was woven into the stars. Jayavarman gestured for them to approach, his voice carrying the calm authority of a mountain stream. He spoke of the capital that would rise from the plains below, a magnificent city mirroring the celestial order, where the god's glory would reflect the prosperity of the people he now served. "We have unified the earth," he declared, his gaze fixing on Sivakaivalya, the high priest. "Now we must anchor it." The plan was ambitious, a network of reservoirs and canals to tame the monsoon rains, ensuring that the Khmer people would never again be at the mercy of the seasons. He envisioned temples of sandstone that would outlast flesh and bone, monuments acting as the world's axis. The warriors who had fought by his side would now become the architects of a civilization. They were no longer mere survivors of Java's shadow. They were the guardians of Angkor. He knew that the stone must speak when the voices of men fell silent in the dust of time. Throughout the day, messengers were dispatched to the corners of the realm. They carried the news of the Devaraja rite, signaling that the fragmentation was over. A single law, a single king, and a single vision would bind them. Jayavarman spent hours over maps of palm leaf, tracing the lines of future roads that would connect the mountain strongholds to the fertile basins. He knew that the unity forged through blood must now be maintained through eternal wisdom and deep compassion. He ordered the construction of hospitals and rest houses, for a king was only as strong as the people who tilled the fields. As twilight descended, casting a violet hue over Mahendraparvata, Jayavarman stood in the solitude of the summit. He thought of the decades spent in exile and the long trek back to his ancestral homeland. Below him, the first campfires of 1,000 labourers flickered like fallen stars, marking the site where the foundations would be laid. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. He felt history shifting from chaos towards structured brilliance. The plateau was no longer just a mountain. It was the birthplace of a legend that would never fade. He knew his time on Earth was finite, yet the empire he had birthed was designed for eternity. It was a kingdom of stone and water, a testament to the resilience of the Khmer spirit. He felt the presence of his ancestors in the rustling leaves and the steady rhythm of his heart. The divine spark within him was a promise to the generations yet unborn. As the moon rose, Jayavarman II finally closed his eyes, finding peace. He had transformed warring tribes into a sovereign power that would dominate the horizon for centuries. The dawn of the Khmer Empire was no longer a dream. It was the unshakable reality of the world. The king slept, but the empire had only just begun to wake.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe my channel.